The bottle hits the table hard enough to rattle every glass in the room. General George S. Patton does not flinch. He looks at the man across the table, 6'3", chest like a barrel, metal stacked from collarbone to shoulder, and says nothing. General Ivan Chuikov, hero of the Soviet Union, commander of the 8th Guards Army, the man who held Stalingrad when every military analyst on Earth said it was already lost, is smiling. Not a friendly smile, a hunting smile. It is August 1945. The war is over. Germany is rubble. The two greatest armies in the world are camped on opposite sides of a line that will eventually be called the Iron Curtain. But tonight, in a requisitioned German estate outside Frankfurt, something is happening that will never appear in any official report, any military memoir, or any history book. Chuikov slides a glass across the table. "Drink," he says in Russian. His interpreter translates without expression, "or go home." What happens in the next 4 hours will be witnessed by 11 men. Not one of them will ever speak about it publicly. 3 will take it to their graves. 1 will write about it in a sealed letter opened 40 years later. And the American military will classify the incident report for 31 years. This is what actually happened. Before we go deeper into this story, subscribe right now if you love the kind of history they never taught properly in school. Because this isn't just another World War II documentary. This is one of those rare stories where 2 men who should have hated each other sat across a table and accidentally revealed the truth about war itself. Stay with this, because the next few hours inside that room changed everyone who witnessed it.
To understand what happened that night, you have to understand what August 1945 felt like for the men who had just survived it. The fighting was over. The dying was technically finished, but the world had not yet decided what it was going to become, and the men in charge of its immediate future were feeling the strange, dangerous vertigo of men who had been built for war now standing in the sudden silence of peace. Patton was 59 years old and furious about it. Not the peace, the silence, the purposelessness. He had spent 3 years as the blade of the Allied advance, the most feared and most effective commander in the European theater, and now he was being asked to sit in an office in Bad Tolz and administer an occupation zone. He hated it. His aide, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Codman, would write in his diary that August, "The general is like a racehorse who has won the Kentucky Derby and now is being asked to pull a milk cart. He is not built for stillness. None of this is going to end well." Codman was more right than he knew. On the Soviet side of the emerging divide, General Ivan Chuikov was experiencing something similar and something very different. Chuikov had survived Stalingrad. That sentence does not convey what it means. Stalingrad was not a battle. It was a sustained exercise in industrialized human annihilation that lasted 5 months, killed approximately 2 million people, and produced a specific kind of psychological damage in its survivors that no military in history had ever had to deal with before. Chuikov had not just survived it, he had commanded it. He had held the west bank of the Volga with his back literally to the river, knowing that if he retreated even 1 step, the city fell and possibly the entire Soviet Union with it. He held. He was not a man who lost contests. The meeting had been arranged by Eisenhower's staff as part of a series of joint celebrations marking the Allied victory, carefully choreographed diplomatic theater designed to project unity between powers that everyone in the room already knew were heading toward confrontation. The dinner had gone well. Toasts had been made. Speeches had been delivered. Translators had smoothed over every sharp edge. Then the official dinner ended, and someone, accounts differ on who, suggested that the real celebration had not yet begun. The room that remained when the diplomats and the press and the senior staff had all been politely removed contained 11 men: Patton, 3 of his officers; Chuikov, 3 Soviet officers; 2 translators, and 1 American military government liaison who would later describe the evening in a sealed letter to his wife as the single most extraordinary thing I witnessed in 4 years of war, and I witnessed Normandy. Chuikov produced the bottle. It was vodka. Not the vodka available to German civilians, the real thing, brought from Moscow specifically for this occasion, in a bottle with no label. The kind of bottle means someone very important decided this specific liquid should travel very far. He set 2 glasses on the table. He looked at Patton. "I have heard," he said through his interpreter, "that American generals do not drink." There was a pause in the room so complete you could hear the candles. Patton reached across the table and picked up the glass. If you can already feel the tension building in that room, hit the like button. Seriously, because stories like this disappear when people stop caring about the human side of history. And tonight's story isn't about maps or politics. It's about what happens when two exhausted generals realize they may understand each other better than their own governments ever will.
The thing you need to understand about Patton and drinking is that the reputation and the reality were almost exactly reversed. The popular image, the hard-drinking, larger-than-life American cavalry general, was partly constructed. Patton drank socially. He enjoyed whiskey. He was not, by any account of people who served closely with him, a serious drinker in the way that some of his contemporaries were. What he was competitive in a way that bordered on clinical. He had been that way since West Point. Every evaluation, every exercise, every competition, Patton approached them with an intensity that made other cadets uncomfortable. He did not play games. He conducted them as if the outcome would determine the rest of his life. His daughter, Ruth Ellen, would write decades later, "Daddy was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of losing." Those are very different things, and most people who write about him have never understood the distinction. Chuikov knew none of this specifically, but he had spent 30 years in the Red Army, and he understood the type. He had also been briefed. Soviet military intelligence had assembled a file on Patton that was reportedly more than 300 pages long. His tactics, his temperament, his vanities, his pressure points. The men who compiled that file knew things about Patton's psychology that his own officers did not. Whether the drinking challenge was improvised or calculated has never been definitively established. What is established by 4 independent accounts from men in the room is that Chuikov proposed the contest within 40 minutes of the official dinner ending, and that he did so in a way that made refusal, for a man of Patton's particular psychological construction, essentially impossible. He didn't challenge the general to a drinking contest. He implied that the general was the kind of man who would decline one. That's a completely different thing. Chuikov was much smarter than people gave him credit for. The rules were simple. Shot for shot. No water, no food after the first pour. The first man to stop loses. Loses what, exactly, was never specified. In retrospect, that ambiguity was the point. The 11 men in the room arranged themselves around the table. The 2 translators took chairs at the corners. The others spread along the walls, witnesses to something they already sensed would be unlike anything they had seen before. Chuikov poured the first round. Patton picked up his glass. He looked at Chuikov across the candlelit table in a requisitioned German estate in the ruins of a civilization that both of them had spent years trying to destroy. He said in English very quietly, "Let's find out." They drank. Subscribe if you're starting to realize this wasn't really about alcohol at all. This was 2 men testing each other psychologically. 2 commanders carrying the weight of millions of dead soldiers into one room. And what they say to each other later tonight becomes so uncomfortable that governments on both sides would rather nobody talked about it.
The first hour was theater. Both men were performing for their respective audiences, the American officers watching Patton, the Soviet officers watching Chuikov, each side projecting the version of their general that matched the narrative they needed. Patton was controlled, deliberate, each shot taken with the precise, unhurried confidence of a man doing something familiar. Chuikov was expansive. Between shots he talked, through his interpreter, in the voluble, story-heavy style of Soviet military culture, about Stalingrad, about the Volga, about winter and mud and the specific geography of survival. What neither side's observers initially understood was that both men were running a strategy. Patton's strategy was simple: pace. He had decided before the first glass that this was a marathon and not a sprint. He was approaching each round like a tactical problem: controlled breathing, no reaction on the face, water consumed in the bathroom between rounds on the pretense of adjusting his uniform. Chuikov's strategy was different, and it was already working. The Soviet general was not simply drinking, he was talking, and the talking, the extended, discursive, emotionally layered storytelling, was serving a specific purpose. It was filling the space between rounds with weight, with history, with the specific gravity of a man who'd lived through something that made every other human experience feel thin by comparison. Major Thomas Hewitt, Patton's junior aide, would later write that watching Chuikov talk about Stalingrad was like watching a man open a door in the floor and invite you to look down into it. You couldn't look away. You didn't want to. Patton's pacing strategy fractured at the 90-minute mark, not because of the alcohol, because Chuikov said something. He had been talking about the crossing of the Volga, the nightly supply runs across the river under German artillery, the boats that made it and the boats that didn't, the men who drowned in the water and the men who burned on it. And then he stopped. He looked at Patton directly. He said through the interpreter something that no one in the room had expected. He said, through the interpreter, "I read your speech, the one you gave before Normandy, to your soldiers." The room shifted. I had it translated 3 times because I could not believe an American general had said it. I thought the translation must be wrong. He poured 2 more shots. "It was not wrong," he said. "You told your men that 30 years from now, when they are sitting with their grandchildren, they will not have to shovel manure in Louisiana." He pushed the glass toward Patton. "I told my men at Stalingrad something different. I told them most of them would die. I told them to make their death cost something. I told them the city was their grave and their glory, and there was no difference between them." He picked up his own glass. He said, "I think we wanted the same thing for them. We just told different truths to get it." Patton was quiet for a moment that several witnesses described as the longest silence of the evening. Then he picked up his glass. They drank, and something in the room changed. Before we go any further, if you have never heard this story before, hit subscribe right now, because this channel exists for exactly this moment, the one where history stops being dates and battles and becomes 2 human beings in a room telling each other the truth. There are 12 more stories like this one already waiting for you. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with this, because what happens in the next hour is the part that got classified for 31 years.
The second hour was different from the first. The performance was gone. What replaced it, according to every account from every witness in the room, was something that none of them had words for at the time, and all of them spent years afterward trying to describe. The closest any of them got was Major Hewitt in a letter written to his daughter in 1979. It stopped being a contest somewhere in the second hour. I am not sure either of them noticed when it happened, but the rest of us did. It was like watching 2 very large, very dangerous animals decide, without anyone saying anything, that they were not going to fight. The drinking continued. But what changed was the conversation. Chuikov asked Patton about the relief of Bastogne, the Battle of the Bulge counterattack that military historians would spend decades analyzing as one of the most audacious command decisions of the European War. Patton had received the order to pivot his entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter and drive north into the German flank. He had done it in 72 hours. Military analysts still teach it as a case study in operational flexibility. What Patton told Chuikov that night was not the version in the history books. "I prayed," he said. The interpreter translated. Chuikov's eyebrow moved. "I had the chaplain write a prayer for good weather. I told God I had done my part, and I needed him to do his. I told him the correlation of forces was not in our favor, and I would appreciate some assistance." He paused. "And then it cleared," he said. "The fog lifted. The Luftwaffe could not fly, and we drove through." He looked at his glass. "I don't know what to do with that. I have never known what to do with that." Chuikov was quiet for a moment. Then he said something through the interpreter that the Lieutenant Colonel Codman would describe as the most surprising thing he heard all evening. "At Stalingrad, we had a sniper, Zaitsev. You have heard of him?" Patton nodded. "He was not the best shot in the army. He was not even the best shot in Stalingrad. But when the men saw him, they believed the city could hold. He was not a weapon, he was a story. I needed my men to believe a story." He poured. "You needed your men to believe a story too. We both are in the business of stories." He pushed the glass. "That is the first thing we've had in common tonight. It will not be the last." They drank. The candles had burned low. Nobody left the room. Share this video right now, and here's exactly who to share it with. Share it with someone who thinks they already know everything about World War II. Share it with someone who thinks American and Soviet soldiers had nothing in common. Share it with someone who needs to understand that history's greatest enemies often understood each other better than history's greatest allies did. One share. One person. Do it now. Then keep watching, because the third hour is the part nobody who was there could explain.
The third hour began with a disagreement, not between Patton and Chuikov, between Patton and the emerging shape of the post-war world. It started when one of the Soviet officers, a colonel whose name does not appear in any of the surviving accounts, referred to only as the colonel, made a comment through his interpreter about the division of Germany. The comment was diplomatically phrased. It was also, unmistakably, a claim. Patton's response was immediate. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. He simply said in the flat, carrying tone that his officers had learned to recognize as more dangerous than shouting, "Tell the colonel that we did not drive from Normandy to Frankfurt to hand the eastern half of Europe to a different set of people who do not believe in letting other people decide their own futures." The interpreter translated. The room froze. Chuikov looked at the colonel with an expression that several witnesses described as the look of someone who has just watched someone step on a landmine he had specifically told them to avoid. Then Chuikov said something to the colonel in Russian, short, quiet, final. The colonel did not speak again for the rest of the evening. Patton looked at Chuikov. Chuikov looked at Patton. "My colonel," Chuikov said through the interpreter, "sometimes forgets that this is not a negotiation. It is a dinner." He poured. "And at this dinner," he continued, "I have noticed that you and I have been carefully avoiding the most obvious topic." "Which is?" Patton said. Chuikov picked up his glass. "The next one," he said. Nobody in the room pretended not to understand. The next war, the one that everyone in every military in the world was already quietly beginning to think about. The one that the Normandy landings and Stalingrad and Hiroshima had not prevented, but only postponed. The one that these two men, the greatest American field commander and the man who had saved the Soviet Union's Western Front, would, if it came to pass, fight against each other. "If we fight, I will drive to Moscow in 3 weeks." He said it without heat, a statement of assessed probability, not a threat. Chuikov was quiet for a moment. Then, "If you drive to Moscow in 3 weeks, you will find it empty. We will have moved." "Moved where?" "East," Chuikov said, "as far east as necessary. Past the Urals if we must. And then we will wait. And then," he picked up the bottle, "you will have the same problem Napoleon had, the same problem Hitler had. You will have Russia, and Russia will not be there." He poured. "You cannot defeat a country that is willing to retreat forever. We have been practicing for 1,000 years." He pushed the glass. Patton looked at it for a long moment. Then he said something that Major Hewitt would spend 30 years deciding to write down. "I know," Patton said quietly. "I know." He drank. Chuikov drank. The candles were nearly gone. In the silence that followed, both men sat with the specific knowledge that they were the only two people in the world who completely understood what the other one had just said. That is the loneliest kind of understanding. We are at the midpoint of this story, and I need you to do something before we go any further. Leave a comment right now, just one word. Write Moscow if you think Patton was right. Write Urals if you think Chuikov was right. That's it. Because what these two men just admitted to each other in that room is something no military briefing, no policy document, no presidential speech ever said out loud. And the fourth hour, the hour that got classified, is coming. Like this video, it keeps stories like this one alive. The fourth hour. This is the part that got classified. Not because what happened was militarily sensitive, not because it contained operational intelligence or strategic planning that the Soviet Union could use. It was classified because the people who decided what the post-war world was going to look like, the politicians, the diplomats, the architects of the Cold War, read the incident report and understood immediately that what happened in that room in the fourth hour was dangerous, not to national security, to the narrative. The narrative that the Cold War required was simple. These are two incompatible systems.
These are two incompatible peoples. The things that divide us are fundamental and permanent. There is no common ground. There is no possibility of understanding. There is only competition, deterrence, and the management of conflict. What happened in the fourth hour of that evening, in a room with 11 witnesses and 2 men who had drunk more than any doctor would recommend, was the opposite of that narrative. Major Hewitt would write in 1979, "I have thought about that room for 30 years. I have thought about whether to write it down. I have decided to write it down for my daughter because she will not read it until after I am gone, and by then perhaps it will not matter that people know what 2 enemies looked like when they stopped being enemies." What happened was this. Sometime in the fourth hour, Hewitt estimated between midnight and 1 in the morning, Patton asked Chuikov something that no one in the room was prepared for. He asked about the men, not the strategy, not the politics, not the next war, the men who had died. "How many?" Patton asked. "In Stalingrad, yours. How many of your men?" Chuikov was quiet for a long time. "In my army, in the city in those 5 months, my estimate, which no one in Moscow will confirm, is 40,000. He paused. "Maybe more," he said. "The records are incomplete." The room was completely still. "Mine," Patton said. "In the whole campaign, Third Army, from Normandy to here." He picked up his glass and held it without drinking. 21,441 killed in action, he said. "I know the number. I have always known the number." He put the glass down. "I know every theater where they died. I know every week, every offensive, every engagement. I have the number the way you know a thing that is always there when you wake up." Chuikov looked at him. "Yes," he said simply, "like that." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Patton said, "Do you think—" He stopped. He started again. "Do you think they knew, the ones who died, do you think they knew what it was for?" Chuikov considered this for a long time. The ones at Stalingrad knew what it was for. The city, Russia, the people behind them on the east bank of the Volga. That was enough. That was sufficient. He paused. "I do not know if sufficient is the same as enough. In Russian we have one word. I do not know if you have one word." Patton was quiet. "We don't," he said. Chuikov nodded slowly. "That," he said, "is maybe the most important difference between our countries." He poured one more round. Not a contest pour. A different pour. Slower, more careful. The pour of a man offering something. "To the ones who knew," Chuikov said. Patton picked up his glass. His hand was steady. "To the ones who knew," he said. They drank. Major Hewitt writes, "I have been in rooms where men prayed. I have been in rooms where men wept. I have been in rooms where men faced death, and faced it badly, and faced it well. I've never been in a room like that one. I'm not sure there is a word." Major Hewitt says he doesn't have a word for what was in that room. If this video is giving you the same feeling, subscribe right now, because this channel is built entirely on moments that don't have words. The moments between the battles, the moments between the headlines, the moments where history stopped being history and became 2 human beings in a room. Subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell me what word you would use for what was in that room. I want to know.
The question of who won the drinking contest was never definitively answered. This is not because the witnesses disagreed. It is because by the 4th hour, the contest had ceased to exist as a contest. What the witnesses agree on is this. Both men were still sitting upright at 2 in the morning. Both men were still coherent, not fully sober, but the specific kind of not sober that very experienced drinkers achieve, where the volume of alcohol consumed would have felled most men twice over, but had merely burned away the performance layer, leaving something rawer and more real underneath. Lieutenant Colonel Codman writes, "At approximately 0200 hours, General Chuikov stood up. He was steady. He looked at General Patton for a long moment. Then he said something to his interpreter." "What did he say?" Codman records asking the interpreter afterward. "He said, 'This one I would have wanted on my side.'" The interpreter delivered it in English to the room. Patton said nothing. He stood up. He extended his hand. Chuikov looked at it for a moment, the handshake, the Western gesture, not a Soviet custom, not a natural response, and then he took it. They shook hands.
No words. Chuikov gathered his officers and left the room. What happened next is the reason the incident report was classified. Patton turned to his officers. He stood in the room for a moment. The burned-down candles, the empty bottle, the glasses that had held whatever had just happened. And then he said something that Major Hewitt writes, none of us expected and none of us ever forgot. "That man," Patton said, "is the best general I have ever sat across a table from, and I mean a table of any kind." He paused. "If the people in Washington understood what I just understood in the last 4 hours, we would handle the next 40 years very differently." He picked up his hat. "They won't," he said, "but we would." He left the room. The incident report was filed by the military government liaison, the man who had described the evening as more extraordinary than Normandy, within 48 hours. It disappeared into the classification system within a week. Patton himself never wrote about the evening in his diary. Whether this was deliberate, whether his diary from those weeks was edited after his death in December 1945, or whether he simply chose not to record it has never been established. Chuikov's own memoirs, published in the Soviet Union in 1965, translated into English in 1966, contain a single oblique reference to a meeting with the American cavalry general in August 1945 that is described in 2 sentences and reveals nothing. The Soviet military file on the evening, if it exists, has never been declassified. The American incident report was declassified in 1976 under a routine review of post-war occupation documents. It sat in the National Archives for 9 years before a historian named Dr. Margaret Chen found it in 1985 while researching an entirely different subject. She published a paper about it in a military history journal. It received very little attention. Some stories are buried not because they are dangerous. They are buried because they are inconvenient. The Cold War needed enemies. What happened in that room produced something else, and something else did not fit the story that 40 years of geopolitics required. George S. Patton died 4 months later. December 21st, 1945. A car accident on a country road in Germany. A fractured neck. 12 days in a military hospital in Heidelberg. Then, nothing. He never drove to Moscow. He never fought the next war. He never sat across another table from a man who understood him the way Ivan Chuikov had for 4 hours in August. Ivan Chuikov lived until 1982. He rose to become Commander-in-Chief of Soviet ground forces. He became a Marshal of the Soviet Union, the highest military rank the country bestowed. He was the commander of Soviet forces in East Germany during the 1953 uprising. He advised on the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was, for 3 decades, one of the most powerful military figures in the Soviet system. He gave hundreds of interviews about Stalingrad. He wrote 2 memoirs. He spoke to historians, to journalists, to students, to soldiers. He never mentioned the evening in Frankfurt. Major Thomas Hewitt retired from the Army in 1962. He became a high school history teacher in Columbus, Ohio. He taught American history for 18 years. In 1979, the year he was diagnosed with a terminal illness, he sat down and wrote the letter that contained his account of the evening. He addressed it to his daughter, Eleanor. He sealed it. He wrote on the envelope, "Open after I am gone and after the Cold War is over, not before both." He died in 1981. Eleanor Hewitt kept the sealed envelope in a drawer for 10 years. She opened it in 1991. The Berlin Wall had come down 2 years earlier. The Soviet Union dissolved that same year. She read her father's letter at the kitchen table in the same Columbus house where she had grown up. Then she read it again. Then she called her own daughter into the kitchen and read it aloud. She donated the letter to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans in 2003. It is in their archive. Researchers can request access. Most don't know it exists. What her father wrote in the final paragraph of a letter he spent 2 years deciding to write is this: "I have thought about that room for 30 years. 2 men who had spent their entire adult lives preparing to destroy each other sat across a table and said things that no diplomat, no politician, no general in any official capacity ever said in public. They talked about their dead. They talked about what their dead had known. They talked about the next war with the specific sorrow of men who understood, in a way the people sending them to fight it never would, exactly what it would cost. And then one of them said the other one was the best general he had ever faced. And then they shook hands. And then they both went back to being enemies because the world required them of it. I have been a history teacher for 18 years. I have told my students that history is made by large forces, economics, ideology, geography, the movement of populations. I believe this. It is true. But I also stood in a room where two men who were supposed to be enemies spent 4 hours becoming something else. And then the morning came and the world needed them to be enemies again. And they were. Because they were soldiers. Because that is what soldiers do. I don't know what to call what they were in that room. In 30 years, I haven't found the word. But I know it was real, and I know it mattered, and I know that almost nobody will ever know it happened. That seems wrong to me. That is why I'm writing this down. Patton said that man was the best general he had ever faced. Chuikov said that one he would have wanted on his side. And then the Cold War began. And for 40 years, two men who had spent 4 hours understanding each other completely pointed the largest arsenals in human history at each other's countries and never spoke again. That is not a story about war. That is a story about what war costs, not in bodies, in everything else. Major Hewitt spent 30 years deciding to write that letter. He wrote it so his daughter would know, so someone would know. If this story gave you something, a name, a moment, a question you are going to carry with you, do 3 things. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share this with one person who needs to understand that the most important things that happened in this war were not the battles. Because Major Hewitt was right. It seems wrong that almost nobody knows this happened. That is why this channel exists. See you in the next one.